Over the past few days, we've had an FLP, a Future Leaders Program, on rethinking anti-corruption strategies in less developed countries. And we're very fortunate to have Professor Mushtaq and Professor Pallavi of SOAS at the University of London, who have shared their insights on the political economy of corruption, on why conventional approaches to corruption often do not work. And the conventional approaches to corruption involve things like promoting transparency and accountability. Mushtaq, why, in your opinion, do most of these conventional approaches fall short of their expectation?
So the main reason that conventional approaches to corruption based on transparency and accountability don't work is that usually the problem in developing countries is that the corruption is totally transparent. People know what's happening. The accountability systems, if you talk about elections or you talk about procedures for sanctioning bureaucrats or taking businesses to court, all those systems exist. So it's not that we need to further keep strengthening these systems. The problem is the existing systems aren't used. And no one asks the very obvious question, in whose interest is it to take on these characters who are breaking laws and siphoning off money and take them to court? And do the people who have an interest in doing this have the power to do so? So the basic question that is missing is an understanding of power and interests in developing countries. And if you don't have an answer to the question, who's going to bell the cat, then buying lots of bells isn't going to solve your problem. And so our approach is to start from that point and look at what works in developing countries, because not everything is totally corrupt. If it was, these countries would be jungles and anarchy. They're not. There are systems that are working. So that means that there are areas of activity where corruption is low, and there are areas of activity where corruption is high. And if you look at it in a little bit more detail, you immediately see that where corruption is low is because powerful actors in their own self-interest are making sure that systems work and that the money which is being allocated for X or Y is not completely diverted to A or B. And our approach is to build on what works, because what works depends on the configuration of power and interests in different countries, and we call that the political settlement. And if you have an understanding of that configuration and you build on it and you say, let us try to enhance what works rather than simply giving systems that no one's going to use, then the people who have the power and the interest will use the systems. And what we have to ensure is that the policies we recommend and we lobby for and we campaign for and we give civil society are not only policies that some actors want to enforce because they have the power and interest to do that, but there are also policies that are in the general interest, right? So what we have in developing countries is that things that the powerful want are happening anyway. We don't have to worry about that. We have to make sure that there's an alignment of interests between some actors that have the power, and the powerful can be at different levels of society. So we are not always talking about powerful does not mean the oligarchs and the prime minister. The powerful could be local landlords in a village, or small peasants, or they could be people who have small companies, SMEs. If those people have the power to block the people who are trying to do the corruption in their domain, and if they have the right incentives, then the corruption stops. We just need to make sure that those policies are also aligned with the public interest. So if SMEs can be incentivized to stop corruption that creates jobs, then it's not just good for the SMEs, it's also good for others. So our policy research is looking for those opportunities, and we churn out lots of such opportunities. And this is where I think anti-corruption is going wrong. Anti-corruption isn't targeted to solving problems. Anti-corruption becomes an end in itself. And when it becomes an end in itself, it's not really very exciting. It has to be linked into in the design of policy design so that the policies are implementable. And if the policy is implementable, by definition, you have reduced some of the resource leakages which were making it unimplementable. And so you get a development dividend. And for us, anti-corruption is only exciting if there's a very strong development dividend and people can see what have we achieved by stopping this corruption.
Well, that's very interesting. Now, the Anti-Corruption Evidence Institute that you run, ACE SOAS, has a huge array of publications that are well worth looking at. But Pallavi, could you give us an example of how you focused work on Bangladesh, on Tanzania, on Nigeria? Could you give us an example or two of how the ACE SOAS approach to anti-corruption has yielded some interesting advances in anti-corruption strategies that previously haven't been very successful, and why have they been promising and worked?
The one reason why those strategies that we have devised as a result of this research have been successful is because we've been able to identify in whose interests those policies work. That's the one major reason. Our research is based on a lot of ethnographic observation of how people behave while going about their regular livelihoods and their daily life. It sounds like a small thing, but it's actually a really consequential part of the research that we do, because once people start behaving in a particular way, it also starts revealing their preferences. And we know then that this is the reason why somebody's being rule following, or this is the reason why somebody's not following the rules. It sounds simple, but it does take a lot of work to unearth this. In Bangladesh, one of our more commonsensical but really very interesting grassroots level research, and we work across levels, it's not necessarily always the grassroots, but this one was, and it's a particular favorite of mine because we are also able to process what power means, because we use the framework of power, capabilities, and interests to figure out how people would follow rules and not. It gives us a very interesting way of processing power too. Just to describe it, in a very short summary, we were looking at why policies for building infrastructure for climate adaptation does not work. There are a lot of leakages. Donors were stopping funding these projects because of those leakages, and it was becoming an imperative because Bangladesh is...
And we're talking about billions of dollars being...
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And Bangladesh is one of the most climate vulnerable countries that we have. They needed those investments. So off we went, and we looked at monitoring agencies and regulating agencies which were the same, but we found that the projects under those agencies had widely differing outcomes. Some were of very good quality, some were of inferior quality that nobody was going to use and not come to any use during a crisis. And then we investigated why that was so, and we realized that the projects that had good quality, let's say an embankment, the embankment was of good quality somewhere where locally powerful members of the community were taking an interest in the construction of that. And here, locally powerful does not have any resonance with what powerful is in the capital, Dhaka.
Sure.
Locally powerful was the smallholder farmer, the one who would sit around in tea shops discussing construction with the contractor. But why was this constituency of locally powerful farmers interested in the construction and the quality of the construction? Now, all embankment projects, adaptation projects have to have a dual purpose. So if it is an embankment, it should also be useful as a road to go to the market or go to the field. Now, if this dual use was actually working for the farmer, if it was taking him to the field, he would be interested. He would sit with the contractor to say that please supply materials that are going to be working. In theory, dual use should be the case every time, but it wasn't happening. But where it was actually dual use, the farmer was getting involved. So it was, we say these are simple, but these are complicated logics to go through in one sense. The tweak here was that the policy already existed. One has to make sure that the local community gets involved, the local farmer gets involved to ensure that good quality material is used, the leakages don't happen, the implementation actually takes place.
And the policy implication is very simple. It's basically saying that when the design of that embankment is determined, the local community should be involved in determining the location of the embankment. This is a small tweak,
right.
But this missing tweak is what means that the embankment was sometimes in a location that no one was interested, and it was badly constructed. And if it was located just 300 yards or 500 yards in another direction, everyone would be interested, and it would be well constructed, and the corruption would come down because the local community would make sure the corruption came down. This is the type of thing that really excites us. They're feasible, they're implementable, and they have high impact.
Just to probe a little bit deeper into the insights that your framework generates, is that, I mean, as I understand it, one of the starting points of your analysis of why conventional approaches don't work is that conventional approaches assume that most people are rule-following in a society, as if they all lived in Denmark. Whereas your starting point is that you need to understand corruption in the context of the fact that most rules are personal, they're unpredictable, and they're not followed. And so tell us a little bit about how, and one of the consequences of that is that top-down enforcement often doesn't work because even the enforcers themselves are corrupt, along with everyone else, as part of a general clientelist political economy in a lot of these countries. So tell us a little bit about, in this case, why top-down enforcement isn't necessarily going to work, and what types of enforcement your framework identifies as being crucial to the success of an anti-corruption strategy, in the case of the infrastructure in Bangladesh.
The enforcement that we are particularly interested in is what we identify as horizontal enforcement.
What is that?
Horizontal enforcement essentially means it's not about some regulator coming from the top and enforcing on me, but am I enforcing among a network of peers? Is it peer-to-peer networking? Somebody who's my equal in power, in productive capability, because none of this is happening in the conventional principal agent sense. This is happening in an ecosystem which is not made up of two individuals. There is a network, there is a community, and there is a constituency. And if there has to be rule following, and the rule following has to be sustainable. This is extremely important for us. The vertical enforcement is not sustainable. The funding goes away, the political will goes away, whether it's an election cycle or a regime change. The vertical enforcement does not sustain. But horizontal enforcement, the way we define it, which is enforcement in self-interest, enforcement because my peer will check on me, because my peer is also interested in himself or herself following the rules and in me following the rules, so that livelihoods can go on, economic opportunities are created. That is when enforcement becomes sustainable. Okay. So that's what we call horizontal checking or horizontal enforcement.
To answer your question, what's the difference? The difference is that if you have a country with a lot of productive organizations that are powerful, the rules work for them.
Yes.
And so there's a huge number of powerful organizations that are invested in making the rules work. And we take that for granted. If you're sitting in an advanced country, you take that for granted, that 95% of the people, 95% of the time are following the rules. In that context, actually all you need to focus on is the vertical enforcement. You need to have the people who are monitoring violations, and as soon as one of the 5% who are violating are caught, there's a lot of pressure on the enforcement agencies from these horizontal actors who don't want the rules to be broken, who put pressure on the police, who put pressure on the courts, who are in the media, who are in politics, to make sure that the vertical enforcement works. So this is the critical difference, is that the more advanced the country, the more the vertical enforcement works, because the horizontal actors that we are talking about are already there. We don't have to look for them. The difference in the developing country context is that there are very few people out there in society who want the rules to work, because no one is following the rules. These are largely informal societies. Productivity is very low. Small businesses and farmers and peasants, they don't follow the health and safety regulations. They don't pay tax. No one is following rules. So they don't have the power and the interest to enforce rules on anyone, because the rules are not meaningful for them. So what we are saying is, yes, the vertical enforcement is very important, but you have to also look for who is going to make this work. In an advanced country, you don't have to look for who's going to make it work, because they exist. Yes. But in a developing country, you have to look for the vertical enforcement and the horizontal enforcement, and that's where the small peasants come in. So the regulator is there, the observer is there, the anti-corruption process is there, But in a village where only the contractor is building a road and no one is interested, no one is going to make that vertical enforcement work. But as soon as you can design the policy which triggers that interest from the local community, suddenly this vertical enforcement works. So we are not saying that the vertical enforcement is irrelevant. It's just that sitting on its own, it's irrelevant. And we have to do two things in a developing country, which is build the vertical system, is already quite well built.
Yes.
The missing bit is designing the policy in every case such that someone is interested in making that policy work.
Right.
This is obvious, but this obvious is amazingly not built into the way we think about anti-corruption.
I mean, this program and this framework is fascinating to me for several reasons. One is in political economy analysis has often been an ivory tower type of endeavor. And this is an interesting way of using political economy and power and interest analysis for policy advocacy and strategizing around anti-corruption. I also imagine that this, to get to the insight that you're getting to, requires a detailed, granular knowledge of the places you're working in, not only to have a political economy framework, but also to do an enormous amount of ethnographic and anthropological research to figure out these power balances at different levels of society. Would that be? And that's one of the reasons why maybe international organizations fails, because they don't undertake the type of analyses in an interdisciplinary way that you need to reach these type of conclusions and insights.
Yes, and you will find every international agency, whether the World Bank, the IMF, or whoever, the Foreign Office here, will say context matters. We really have to take context into account. But then they don't know how context matters. What is it about the context that matters, and what should inform your policy? And then they will commission all kinds of political economy analysis, which is very random. People are talking about different things and nothing adds up. And we are saying context matters in a very specific way. Context matters in understanding whether your policies can be enforced.
Right.
So that is determined by the policy. So who benefits from this policy, who loses from this policy, what are the benefits from this policy, and what are the actors around that policy, what are their relative powers and interests and capabilities. And when you look at that ecosystem, you will immediately understand whether this policy is implementable or whether those resources will be just disappeared and go into people's pockets.
Right.
Now, this is self-evident, but getting a handle on this configuration of power and interest around a policy also means you need to understand in a broader sense the configuration of power in the country, because this is not hanging in the air. So if you want to understand how the local power in that village works, you also need to understand how this is embedded in the national politics of Bangladesh, how these people are connected to national parties, the patron-client structures, whether what you are suggesting will actually be implementable or not. And in some cases, you need to figure out how the national politics is connected to global politics, because if you're looking at things like illicit financial flows, or if you're looking at things like investments in the power sector, you have global players coming in. And so you have to look at the distribution of power beyond the national boundaries in many cases. So which configuration of power is relevant depends on the problem you are addressing, but it really requires people with a pretty, live understanding of what is going on around us at the global level, national level, regional level.
Sure.
And this is missing. Right? So there are not many people who have that. I would say that policy design, anti-corruption, governance, this is an art, right? It really requires people who can understand very complex and fluid configurations and then take a hunch and then come up with a hypothesis which is then tested. Sure. So that is the next stage of our, we come up with hunches and ideas, and then we test it empirically. So it is an evidence-based anti-corruption strategy.
Right.
Or we have small experiments which see, is this actually implementable? And only then do you scale it up. And I think the problem is national governments, development partners, they usually don't have the patience to do all this.
I think going back to the very first point that you made about why transparency and accountability do not work, that in itself is a very ahistorical understanding of how corruption came about. It's a historical institutionalist overhang, if I may put it that way. You know, 150 years ago, what we now call developed countries did not look like this. You know, the vertical enforcement that Mushtaq was talking about did not even exist then. That's been a gradual and organic evolution. And developing countries are having to telescope that evolution, so asking them to go through those hoops without the kind of historical timelines that developed countries have is also very unfair. So the context changes incredibly in almost geometric proportions, therefore. So, which is, and then there are the colonial underpinnings. If you do not understand the colonial social re-engineering how it happened, you know, in the context that we work in Nigeria, Bangladesh, in the earlier phase of ACE, we worked in Tanzania, the other countries that we worked in, a lot of the colonial legacies have an effect on how the current political economy or the political settlement is structured.
Okay, just to wind up briefly, I mean, as you know, the SOAS Development Leadership Dialogue is interested in moving beyond wish lists, and it's interested in developing a dialogue and a conversation around feasible strategies. Because I think we think development has too many wish lists and not enough feasible strategizing. We've had about 14 or 15 participants from several countries around the world. And many of them are experts or work on anti-corruption commissions in their countries, in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. What advice would you give them, just brief advice in their careers moving forward in this terrain?
For anti-corruption in particular, I would say that since we are in developing countries living in societies which are largely informally structured, a lot of transactions are informal. If you don't have a really strong prioritization of what is the problem you're trying to address, if you don't link your anti-corruption efforts with achieving specific outcomes which you think are feasible, there is a very high chance you will get depressed. There's a very high chance you will get stuck into demoralized by trying to do things which are actually unimplementable because you're stepping on really powerful interests without understanding how you need to break up those coalitions and create counter coalitions. So corruption in developing countries is never the lone operator who has done something and everybody around you is following the rules, and as soon as you detect this person, it's corrected because 95% of people around you want it to be corrected. Most of the important corruption that is happening in developing countries involves networks of people who are colluding, politicians, businesses, bureaucrats, and so trying to go after one of them without understanding the network is doomed to failure. So if you want to have a strategy, you need to identify counter coalitions who in their own interest will support you in blocking that coalition, and this requires a new political way of thinking about policy that is often missing. And transparency, accountability doesn't take us there. Whereas if you think of power and interests, and you work in terms of creating civil society, social, political alliances to get to a goal that you want, better education, better health, fighting the corruption in the power sector, whatever it is, building better embankments, you need to always think of creating coalitions of power who will then make your transparency accountability system work. So, and that advice means that people who are purely working on anti-corruption need to think out of the box. They need to talk to people who are sociologists, political scientists, politicians, businesses, really understand the ecosystems of their country, and then decide on what is worth fighting and with whom. And the with whom is critical. You're not going to do this simply as an anti-corruption actor using legal tools. You're not going to make much progress just like that.
And for me, it is really one simple sentence that incremental can be transformative. There is this sense that it has to be big bang, it has to be really ambitious, it's all about having that big national anti-corruption strategy and every powerful person must be held accountable. But we tend to then not look at the opportunities that exist at the level of activities, subsectors, where you're doing small things, but you're actually changing the distribution of power and productive capabilities. It's incremental, you're joining the dots up, but that joining the dots up is a really transformative process. And for me, that's the most important message to take across.
Mushtaq, Pallavi, thank you very much for sharing these fascinating insights. There's so much more we could explore, but we're going to have to leave it there for now. Thanks again.
Thank you.